there is a growing group of people in DC that I wouldn't call them isolationists. I would call them, foreign policy realists. The idea that we should not get involved in every single conflict in the world. We shouldn't commit all of our resources everywhere in the world whenever an ally of ours has some kind of problem. Now, again, the situation in Israel is very complex, but and I know we'll get to this in a little bit, but even when J.D. Vance started being very vocally critical of the war in Ukraine, he was saying, why are we sending all of our armament to Ukraine and we're not going to be able we don't have enough munitions to actively counter China if, for whatever reason, we end up starting a hot war with China. So I think that there are people that they want the U.S. to be strong. We want to be secure. We do want to be able to defend our interests across the country or across the world, but ultimately it's what is the priority? What are the order of priorities? And Elbridge Colby, who's at DOD, he's always been arguing that Taiwan and the South China Sea, that is the number one priority. And everything else takes a backseat.
I love it when people who I interpret to be isolationists are actually hawkish, but just hawkish in a little bit of a different degree, instead of on the Eastern Front, on the way far Eastern front.
Look, it's a strong argument that the most important strategic location for the U.S. that's not in the U.S. is Taiwan, because the entire modern world runs on the chips that Taiwan.
I feel like this is all very connected, though, and that's why if you're concerned about addressing China, it's worth addressing Russia as well, because China, I think it was last year or so,
said Russia yet, though.
They said they had an endless relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, and Russians are getting cheap oil right now, or the Chinese are getting cheap oil from the Russians right now. Iran is sending the drones that they have to use in Russia. North Koreans are fighting against Ukrainians in Ukraine right now. So I think all of this stuff is connected, and there's a united front that's against U.S. hegemony, and I think it's worth not just focusing on one part, although I'm extremely hawkish when it comes to China as well.
You could just stopped it. Extremely hawkish.
Yeah. So. Well, I believe in peace through strength, and I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to protect, because I think once we pull out, the less involved the United States is in geopolitical affairs, unfortunately, the more stuff breaks down. If the United States stop being interested in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, more conflict would break out in all of these regions, because I think the United States acts as a stabilizing force through the strength in our military power.
I think I would disagree with that. And it is actually it's kind of funny. What you're saying, I think, is most likely true, but it sounds really similar to the whole axis of evil speech from post 9/11. Which got us into a lot of problems. And I ultimately think I agree with your broader point, but I will say I don't think the U.S. has been a stabilizing force, especially in Africa. Everything with the Wagner Group. Russia has been running wild in Africa, and part of the French. It was the French African countries. They screwed everything up in Africa. And then the U.S. had to step in, but the U.S. wasn't prepared to do that, and so the Russians went wild. And ultimately, that is the fault of the French. And I think it goes back to, the U.S. has a lot of different security priorities. We need to make sure those are accomplished. We need to be able to make sure we have the munitions and the agreements to maintain that. But we're always going to fail at it if our allies don't step up to the plate. And I think in the context of Israel, now who knows what the actual situation behind this article is, but the U.S.-Israel relationship, although very strong, is very much push and pull right now. And it's totally within Israel's prerogative to do so, because, again, they have their own strategic interests. But if Iran and Trump are actually serious about a deal, and there is one that's going to come through, it is not in Israel's interest for that to happen. But again, I don't think that they would ultimately make that decision, for the same reason that Trump and Vance go to Europe and they criticize the European Union, and what can they actually do? Nothing, really, because they're not strong. They still rely on U.S. security guarantees, and its function is a drain on us. And I think that part of the work of Trump and JD and Rubio in particular as Secretary of State has been to pull back our commitments in areas where it really doesn't matter. I don't think that our efforts in Africa have been very fruitful. There's a good argument for some of the humanitarian programs, I think, but ultimately we have never had a good relationship with African countries, especially now not with South Africa, and the Chinese and the Russians have been running wild.
Well, let me
So
just
South
say,
Africa, good.
I'll just say too, like last year I backpacked Africa. Wagner is everywhere. And I was backing through Eastern Africa, which is a region that's not on the table geopolitically speaking. Everywhere, Chinese, everywhere.
Does anyone have a sense of what Russia's goals are, having military, PMCs over there in these areas? Because it's my sense that there's a lot of Islamic terrorism that spawns from that area, and keeping that kind of busy so that way it doesn't reach out into Russia or the US. The US's involvement was to prevent it from reaching out into the US. That was a large argument for it. Now I'm not saying that I agree with it or whatever, but if there's if there's another argument. Well, yeah, I mean, I understand the minerals and stuff, but that's economic stuff. There's
a vacuum there in Eastern Africa. Since the British left, it's just been chaos.
Thanks for checking out this clip from Timcast IRL. Make sure to watch the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. Subscribe to this channel, and we will see you all there.